What if your family built you a beautiful palace as a gift, and it was actually a death trap designed to burn you alive while you slept? What if you won a bride in a competition so spectacular that 5 brothers all married her? The same woman, sparking a scandal that would echo through history. And what if you were invited to a friendly game of dice, and by the time the game was over, you had lost your kingdom, your wealth, your brothers, your freedom, and even your wife, who was then dragged into a public hall by her hair and humiliated in front of the entire court? This is where the Mahabharata shifts from childhood rivalry to something irreversible. This is where attempted murder becomes actual warfare. This is where pride, honor, and vengeance collide in ways that make reconciliation impossible. Welcome to episode 4 of the Mahabharata. Today, we witness the Pandavas lose everything. But more importantly, we witness how they survive, how they fight back, and how the seeds of the Great War finally take root in blood and shame. After the tournament where Karna appeared and Arjuna established himself as the greatest archer, tensions in Hastinapura reached a breaking point. The presence of the 5 Pandavas was becoming intolerable to Duryodhana and his brothers. Duryodhana went to his father, Dhritarashtra, and made his case clearly. "Father, as long as the Pandavas live, we will never truly inherit the throne. The people love them. Bhishma favors them. They are stronger, more skilled, and have the support of the kingdom. We must act now or we will lose everything." Dhritarashtra, the blind king who had always chosen not to see the truth, finally gave his tacit approval. He didn't explicitly order the murder of his nephews, he never would. But he didn't forbid it either. His silence was permission enough. Duryodhana and his uncle Shakuni devised a plan more sophisticated than simple poison or staged accidents. They would send the Pandavas away from Hastinapura under the pretense of honor, and then eliminate them where no one could witness or intervene. The plan was this: there was a religious festival in a town called Varanavata. Duryodhana suggested that the Pandavas should represent the royal family at this festival, staying there for an extended period. It seemed like an honor, a sign of trust. Kunti and her sons, eager to reduce tensions, agreed, but Duryodhana had already sent his minister Purochana ahead to Varanavata with secret instructions. Purochana was to build a magnificent palace for the Pandavas, a palace made primarily of lac, resin, ghee, and other highly flammable materials. The walls, the floors, the pillars, everything was designed to burn quickly and intensely. It was a death trap disguised as a gift. The plan was simple. Once the Pandavas were comfortably settled in this beautiful palace, Purochana would set it on fire in the middle of the night. The entire family would burn to death in their sleep. It would look like a tragic accident, a lamp knocked over perhaps, or a kitchen fire that spread too quickly. Duryodhana would express grief and sorrow, and the succession would be secure. But Vidura, the wise uncle who had always tried to protect the Pandavas, discovered the plot. He couldn't openly defy Dhritarashtra or Duryodhana. His position was too precarious, but he could warn the Pandavas cryptically. Vidura came to Yudhishthira and spoke in code. A wise man knows that a house made of flammable materials is no house at all. He who understands this and prepares accordingly will survive what others cannot. Yudhishthira, the wisest of the Pandavas, understood immediately. They were being sent into a trap, but rather than refuse to go, which would reveal that they knew and create an open confrontation, Yudhishthira decided they would go to Varanavata, appear unsuspecting but prepare their escape. The Pandavas and Kunti arrived in Varanavata and were received with great ceremony. The palace that Purochana had built was indeed magnificent, spacious, beautiful, and apparently luxurious. But Bhima, running his hands along the walls, immediately confirmed what they suspected. The palace smelled of lac and resin. The materials were highly combustible. "This is not a palace," Bhima said quietly. "This is a funeral pyre waiting to be lit." Pandavas pretended everything was normal. They thanked Purochana profusely. They acted delighted with their accommodations. But secretly they began to prepare. Following Vidura's advice, they had brought a trusted miner with them, a man loyal to Vidura who knew how to dig tunnels. Every night, while Purochana thought they were sleeping, the Pandavas and the miner worked to dig a secret tunnel from the center of the palace to the nearby forest. The tunnel was carefully concealed, and they removed the dirt bit by bit so no one would notice. Months passed. The Pandavas lived in the palace, attended the festival, participated in public ceremonies, and gave no indication that they suspected anything. Purochana grew impatient. He had been instructed to wait until the Pandavas were completely comfortable and unsuspecting. Finally, he decided the time had come. On a particular night, after a feast where the Pandavas appeared to eat and drink heavily, Purochana prepared to set the fire, but the Pandavas were ready. Just before dawn, they gathered their mother and slipped into the tunnel they had dug. But they did not leave the palace empty. Earlier that evening, a tribal woman and her 5 sons had come to the palace begging for shelter and food. Kunti, in a moment that would haunt her, had given them shelter, knowing they would likely die. The Bardis would provide proof that the Pandavas had perished. As the Pandavas escaped through the tunnel, Bhima, taking matters into his own hands, set the fire himself. He wanted to ensure that Purochana, the architect of this murder attempt, would die in his own trap. The palace erupted in flames. The fire was massive, violent, consuming everything within minutes. The entire town woke to the sight of the magnificent palace burning. By the time anyone could react, it was too late. The palace collapsed. When the ruins were searched, they found 6 Bardis, burned beyond recognition but identifiable as a woman and 5 young men. News spread quickly. The Pandavas and Kunti had died in a tragic fire. In Hastinapura, Duryodhana barely hid his satisfaction. Dhritarashtra performed all the rituals of mourning, weeping publicly for his nephews while privately relieved. Only Bhishma and Vijaya mourned genuinely, though Vijaya hoped against hope that his warning had been understood. But the Pandavas were alive. They had escaped through the tunnel and disappeared into the forest, determined to remain hidden until it was safe to reveal themselves. The Pandavas spent months hiding in forests, disguised as Brahmins, wandering priests and scholars. Kunti and her 5 sons lived in poverty and obscurity, surviving on whatever charity they could receive. It was a stark contrast to their lives as princes, but it kept them alive. During this time, Bhima encountered and killed several demons who terrorized local villages, building a reputation as a powerful warrior even in disguise. But they remained careful not to reveal their true identities. The Pandavas heard rumors from the towns they passed through. Hastinapura mourned them. The kingdom had moved on. Duryodhana was now the uncontested heir. The palace had forgotten them. But they also heard other news that would change everything. King Drupada of Panchala, the same king who had been humiliated by Drona, was holding a Swayamvara for his daughter. A Swayamvara was an ancient tradition where a princess would choose her husband from assembled suitors. But Drupada's Swayamvara had a unique challenge, one so difficult that it was clearly designed with a specific warrior in mind. Drupada had not forgotten his humiliation at the hands of Drona and the Kuru princes. He had performed a great sacrifice, and from the sacred fire had been born 2 children, Drishtadyumna, a son destined to kill Drona, and Draupadi, a daughter of such extraordinary beauty and presence that she seemed to embody divine fire itself. Draupadi was dark-skinned, unusual for the time and region, but radiantly beautiful. More importantly, she was intelligent, strong-willed, and carried herself with a dignity that made her seem like a goddess in human form. The challenge of the Swayamvara was this. A massive bow was set up in the center of the arena. High above, a revolving fish was mounted. Below the fish was a pool of oil that reflected its image. The challenge was to string the heavy bow, and using only the reflection in the oil as a guide, never looking up at the fish itself, shoot an arrow through the eye of the spinning fish. It was nearly impassable. It required tremendous strength to string the bow, extraordinary skill with archery, and perfect focus to shoot using only a reflection while the target spun rapidly. Kings and princes from all the kingdoms arrived for the Swayamvara. Duryodhana came with Karna. Powerful warriors from across the land attempted the challenge. One by one they failed. Most couldn't even string the massive bow. Those who could string it couldn't hit the target. Those who hit the target missed the eye. The Pandavas, still disguised as Brahmins, sat in the section reserved for priests and scholars, watching quietly. Arjuna's eyes never left the bow. He understood the challenge instantly. He knew he could do it. Karna stepped forward. He was one of the few who could actually string the bow. He took his position, aimed using the reflection, and his arrow flew true. But just as he was about to shoot, Draupadi spoke. "I will not marry the son of a charioteer," she declared publicly. The humiliation was profound. Karna, still carrying the shame of his supposed low birth, lowered the bow and walked away. The crowd murmured. Duryodhana was furious. Then Arjuna stood up from the Brahmin section. Dressed in simple robes, looking like a wandering priest, he walked to the bow. The crowd laughed. Kings and princes had failed. What could a Brahmin do? Arjuna lifted the bow as if it weighed nothing. He strung it in one fluid motion. He positioned himself, looked only at the reflection in the oil, and in a movement so fast and perfect that many didn't see it happen, he shot the arrow through the eye of the spinning fish. The crowd erupted in shock and applause. Draupadi, who had been watching with bored disappointment, suddenly smiled. She approached Arjuna and placed the victory garland around his neck. He had won her hand in marriage, but the chaos that followed was immediate. Kings and princes were outraged. A Brahmin winning a Swayamvara meant for warriors. It was an insult. Fights broke out. Bhima revealed his strength defending his brother, fighting off multiple warriors at once. In the confusion, the Pandavas escaped with Draupadi. The Pandavas brought Draupadi to the humble dwelling where Kunti was staying. Arjuna, excited, called out, "Mother, look what we have brought." Kunti, not looking up from her prayers, responded automatically, "Whatever it is, share it equally among all 5 of you." The moment the words left her mouth, everyone froze. In their culture, a mother's word was absolute and could not be taken back. Kunti had just commanded that Draupadi be shared among all 5 brothers. The situation was unprecedented and scandalous. One woman marrying 5 men was unheard of in their society. It violated every social norm, but Kunti's word could not be undone. And Yudhishthira, always bound by dharma and rules, insisted that they must honor their mother's command. Draupadi, showing the strength of character that would define her, agreed. She laid down her own conditions. She would be the equal wife of all 5 brothers. Each brother would spend 1 year with her in turn. When she was with one brother, the others could not intrude. Any brother who violated this rule would be exiled for 12 years. The marriage was arranged. Draupadi became the wife of all 5 Pandavas, a situation that would become one of the most debated aspects of the epic. Was it a symbol of her remarkable position and power, or was it a burden that would lead to her greatest suffering? The answer, like everything in the Mahabharata, is complicated. News of this marriage spread quickly and it reached Hastinapura. The Pandavas were alive. They had won the princess of Panchala. They had allied with King Drupada, who commanded a powerful army. Duryodhana was furious and terrified. The Pandavas had survived, had grown stronger, and now had powerful allies. But Bhishma and Vidura saw an opportunity for peace. They convinced Dhritarashtra that rather than continue this cycle of attempted murder and revenge, the kingdom should be divided. Give the Pandavas their share, let them rule independently, and avoid civil war. Dhritarashtra, always weak and always choosing the path that required the least from him, agreed. The kingdom was divided. The Kauravas kept Hastinapura and the prosperous, developed regions. The Pandavas were given Khandavaprastha, a barren, forest-covered wasteland that had been abandoned and was considered virtually uninhabitable. It was an insult disguised as generosity. Duryodhana laughed at the thought of the great Pandavas ruling over nothing but forests and ruins, but the Pandavas accepted. They took their share without complaint and set about transforming it. Through years of hard work, with the help of the celestial architect Vishwakarma, whom Krishna helped them invoke, they transformed Khandavaprastha into Indraprastha, a city so magnificent, so advanced, so beautiful that it rivaled and perhaps exceeded Hastinapura itself. The palace of Indraprastha was legendary. It had floors so polished they looked like pools of water. It had pools of water so clear they looked like starlit floors. It had crystal walls that seemed invisible. It was a marvel of architecture and illusion. The Pandavas ruled wisely and well. Yudhishthira performed the Rajasuya Yajna, a royal sacrifice that declared him emperor. Kings from across the known world came to pay tribute. The Pandavas' power and prestige grew beyond anything Duryodhana had imagined possible. And this success, this transformation from exiled princes to mighty emperors, drove Duryodhana mad with jealousy. Duryodhana visited Indraprastha for the Rajasuya ceremony. What he saw there destroyed him emotionally. The Pandavas, who should have died in the fire, were not just alive but thriving. Their city was more beautiful than his. Their power was greater. They were everything he had tried to prevent them from becoming. Walking through the palace of illusions, Duryodhana made mistakes that became legendary humiliations. He saw a clear floor and thought it was water, lifting his clothes to avoid getting wet, only to realize it was solid ground. He saw a pool of water and thought it was floor, walking confidently forward and fell into the water with a splash. The servants laughed. Bhima laughed loudest of all, his booming, mocking laughter echoing through the halls, and worse, Draupadi was present. Some versions say she laughed, some versions say she made a comment, "The blind son has blind sons." Whether she actually said this is debated, but Duryodhana believed she had, and in his mind he had been humiliated by the Pandavas and their wife in front of the entire world. He returned to Hastinapura consumed with rage and jealousy. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He lay in his chambers, staring at the ceiling, obsessing over the Pandavas' success and his own humiliation. His uncle Shakuni saw his opportunity. Shakuni was a master manipulator with his own reasons to destroy the Kuru dynasty. He had been planning his revenge for years, and now he had the perfect tool, Duryodhana's wounded pride. "There is a way to destroy them without war," Shakuni whispered. "Challenge Yudhishthira to a game of dice." Shakuni's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Yudhishthira had a weakness: he was addicted to gambling. Despite being the wisest and most righteous of the Pandavas, despite never lying, despite his adherence to Dharma, Yudhishthira could not refuse a challenge to gamble. It was his one fatal flaw. Moreover, Yudhishthira was terrible at dice. He lost constantly. But worse, according to the codes of honor for warriors, once a challenge to gamble was issued, it could not be refused, and once gambling began you could not stop until the challenger was satisfied. Shakuni, on the other hand, was a master. Some versions suggest his dice were loaded, made from the bones of his father, magically designed never to lose. Other versions simply say he was extraordinarily skilled. Either way, in a game between Shakuni and Yudhishthira, there could only be one outcome. Duryodhana convinced Dhritarashtra to invite the Pandavas to Hastinapura for a friendly game of dice. Dhritarashtra, always weak, always hoping to keep his son happy, agreed. Vijaya protested strongly. He warned that this would end in disaster, but Dhritarashtra ignored him. The invitation was sent. Yudhishthira, bound by honor and unable to refuse a challenge, accepted, despite the protests of his brothers, despite the warnings of Draupadi, despite his own misgivings. The Pandavas travelled to Hastinapura for what would become the most catastrophic game of dice in history. The game was held in the royal court with the entire assembly present. Bhishma was there, troubled but silent. Drona was there, uncomfortable with what was happening but unwilling to intervene. Karna was there, supporting Duryodhana. Dhritarashtra was there, listening to descriptions since he could not see. Vijaya was there, furious but powerless. The rules were simple: Yudhishthira would stake something. Shakuni, playing on behalf of Duryodhana, would match the stake. They would roll the dice. Shakuni won every single roll. Yudhishthira started small: gold, jewels, precious items. He lost. He staked more: elephants, horses, chariots. He lost. He staked his treasury. He lost. He staked his lands, his palace, his entire kingdom. He lost it all. His brothers watched in horror. "Stop," they cried, "this is madness." But Yudhishthira could not stop. The game had him in its grip, or perhaps his rigid sense of honor had him trapped. Once you start, you cannot stop until the challenger releases you. And Duryodhana, through Shakuni, was not done yet. "What else do you have to wager?" Shakuni asked sweetly. Yudhishthira, having lost everything else, said, "I stake my brother Nakula." He lost. Nakula now belonged to Duryodhana, technically a slave. "And next?" Shakuni prompted. One by one Yudhishthira staked and lost his brothers: Sahadeva, Bhima, even Arjuna, his greatest warrior, his closest brother. All lost, all now technically slaves of Duryodhana. The court watched in horror. This was beyond any normal game. This was a systematic destruction of a family happening in real time. Then Shakuni asked, "What else remains?" Yudhishthira, in the grip of the gambling fever, or perhaps simply following the logic of Dharma to its darkest conclusion, said, "I stake myself." He lost. Yudhishthira, emperor and eldest Pandava, was now a slave. And then Shakuni, with poisonous sweetness, asked, "Surely there is one more thing you could wager, one precious thing that remains." Yudhishthira, in what would become the most debated and criticized decision of his life, staked Draupadi. The court gasped. Even those who supported Duryodhana were shocked. Could a man who had already lost himself, who was technically a slave, still have the right to wager his wife? The legal and dharmic questions were complex, but Shakuni rolled the dice before anyone could fully object. And Yudhishthira lost. Duryodhana's eyes gleamed with triumph and malice. He turned to his brother Dushasana and gave an order that would echo through history. "Bring Draupadi here. She is our slave now. Bring her to this court." Dushasana went to Draupadi's chambers. She was in her private quarters, wearing a single garment as she had just bathed and was in her monthly period, a time when, according to custom, she should not appear in public. "You must come to the court," Dushasana demanded. "You have been lost in a game of dice. You are now our servant." Draupadi was incredulous, then furious. "Go back and ask this question in the court. Can a man who has already lost himself, who is himself a slave, still wager his wife? Let the great scholars and elders answer this question. I will abide by their judgment." It was a brilliant legal question that went to the heart of the matter. Dushasana returned and posed the question to the court, but no one answered. Bhishma was silent. Drona was silent. Dhritarashtra was silent. No one wanted to condemn Duryodhana's actions, but no one could justify them either. Dushasana returned to Draupadi. "They debate your clever questions, but meanwhile you are summoned. If you will not come willingly, I will bring you by force." "I am in no condition to appear in public," Draupadi said. "I cannot come." Dushasana grabbed her by her hair, her long dark hair, and dragged her through the palace corridors into the public court. Draupadi, wearing only a single garment, bleeding, was dragged by her hair in front of the entire assembly. The humiliation was absolute. She called out to the elders, "Bhishma, grandfather, how can you sit silent? Drona, teacher, how can you watch this? Is there no dharma in this court? Is there no honor?" But they sat silent, trapped by their loyalty to the throne, trapped by complex questions of law, trapped by their own weakness. Duryodhana sat on a throne that was not his and patted his thigh, gesturing obscenely at Draupadi. "Come, sit here, you are our slave now." Dushasana, encouraged by the silence of the elders and the support of Duryodhana, decided to go further. "If she is our slave," he said, "then let us remove her garment. Slaves have no right to royal clothing." He grabbed the edge of Draupadi's sari and began to pull. Draupadi, realizing that no one would save her, raised her arms to heaven and called upon Krishna, the divine friend who had become like a brother to the Pandavas. "Krishna," she cried, "if you have ever loved me, if our friendship means anything, save me now." And a miracle occurred. As Dushasana pulled at her sari, it kept extending. He pulled, and more fabric kept appearing. He pulled until he was exhausted and a mountain of cloth piled up beside him, but Draupadi remained clothed. It was as if Krishna himself was providing an endless sari, protecting her modesty even as everyone else failed her. Finally, Dushasana collapsed, exhausted. The court sat in stunned silence at the miracle they had just witnessed. Draupadi, still standing, clothed by divine intervention, spoke, and her words were not pleas but vows. "I will not tie up my hair," she declared, "until it is washed in the blood of Dushasana. I will leave it loose and disheveled as a reminder of this humiliation until the day Bhima tears open Dushasana's chest and I bathe my hair in his blood." Then she turned to the entire court. "You have all witnessed this, you have all sat silent. Remember this day, because a reckoning is coming." Even Dhritarashtra, blind and weak as he was, recognized that something terrible had just happened, something that could not be undone. Frightened by omens and the reactions of the court, he tried to undo the damage. "Draupadi," he said, "ask me for any boon, I will grant you anything to undo this wrong. Give me back my husband's freedom," she said, "let them no longer be slaves." "Granted," Dhritarashtra said immediately. "Ask for another boon. Give us back our kingdom, our weapons, our dignity." "Granted, ask for a third boon." "I ask for nothing more," Draupadi said coldly. Kshatriyas win their fortunes by strength, not by begging for gifts. The Pandavas were free. Technically everything was restored to them, but nothing was truly restored. The humiliation could not be undone, the violation could not be forgiven. The line had been crossed, but Duryodhana was not satisfied. The Pandavas still had their kingdom, they were still a threat. He convinced his father to issue one more challenge, one more game of dice. This time the stakes were different, one roll. Winner takes all. Loser goes into exile for 12 years and then must spend 1 year in disguise. If they are recognized during that 13th year, the exile starts over for another 13 years. Yudhishthira, who should have learned his lesson, who should have refused, was still bound by his fatal flaw. He could not refuse a challenge to gamble. He agreed. Shakuni rolled the dice. The Pandavas lost. Everything they had built, Indraprastha, their kingdom, their power, was lost again. But this time, instead of death, they faced 13 years of exile. 12 years in the forest, living as hermits. 1 year in disguise, hiding among common people. If they survived those 13 years, they could return and reclaim their kingdom. If they were discovered during the 13th year, the cycle would start again. The Pandavas accepted. What choice did they have? They prepared to leave Hastinapura for the forest. Draupadi, who had been a princess and empress, would now live as an exiled wanderer. But before they left, Draupadi turned to Dhritarashtra and the court one final time. "Mark my words. 13 years from now, the streets of Hastinapura will run with blood. The sons you protect today will be corpses tomorrow. This court that sat silent during my humiliation will be a charnel ground. You had a chance for peace. You chose war." And with that prophecy hanging in the air, the Pandavas walked out of Hastinapura into exile, beginning the countdown to the greatest war the world had ever seen. So now we stand at the true breaking point. The Pandavas have lost everything twice. They've survived attempted murder, emerged stronger, built an empire, only to lose it all in a rigged game of dice. And Draupadi, the woman who should have been protected by the greatest warriors in the land, was humiliated in a public court while heroes sat silent. This is why the war becomes inevitable. Not because of curses or prophecies, but because of choices. Duryodhana chose cruelty, Dushasana chose violence, Dhritarashtra chose weakness, and Bhishma, Drona and the other elders chose silence. But the Pandavas also made choices. Yudhishthira chose his addiction over his family. Bhima, Arjuna and the others sat helpless during Draupadi's humiliation, bound by laws they could not break. And Draupadi? She chose to survive, to remember and to demand justice. Her vow to leave her hair untied until it was washed in Dushasana's blood becomes the emotional heart of the war. This is not just about kingdoms and thrones. This is about a woman's dignity violated and a promise of vengeance. 13 years from now, when the Pandavas return, there will be one final attempt at peace. Krishna himself will try to negotiate. He will offer Duryodhana compromise after compromise, but we already know it will fail, because Draupadi's hair is still untied, because her humiliation still burns, because 13 years of exile has not cooled the rage, it has only allowed it to mature into something cold, calculated and unstoppable. The next episode will cover those 13 years, what the Pandavas learned, how they grew stronger, and the 13th year when they lived in disguise in the kingdom of Varanavata. And then, finally, we will reach the moment when diplomacy fails and war becomes the only option. The greatest war in history is no longer approaching. It is now inevitable.